On behalf of the African and African American Studies Department and the Dole Institute of Politics, I'd like to thank you and welcome you to tonight's, thank you for coming and welcome you to tonight's lecture. My name is Sean Lee Alexander. I'm an assistant professor of African and African American Studies, as well as the interim director of the Langston Hughes Center for African American Studies here at KU. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor David W. Blight to the KU campus. He is the 1954 Professor of American History and the Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. Professor Blight is the foremost scholar of historical memory. His work examines how we individually, collectively, remember our historical past, challenges us to reconsider our history, how that history was constructed, and what the consequences of certain interpretations have been for the nation. In his unprecedented, award-winning work, Race and Reunion, he demonstrates that a national memory based on reconciliation triumphed over several other competing and equally important memories of the war. Blight's argument is concise and direct. In the 4 decades after the Civil War, Southern and Northern whites agreed that the deepest meaning of the conflict was to be found in the commemorating the valor and the courage of the soldiers of both sides. The Union cause had transfigured into the lost cause, leading to the credence of the saying, "The North won the war, but lost the peace." While many may agree with his argument, it is still important to emphasize his conclusions, because the meaning of the memory of race, slavery, the Civil War, and freedom are contentious issues that are still being fought over in areas throughout this country. Today, we have a presidential candidate, Senator Barack Obama, being forced to address the nation on the issue of race in this country to legitimize his candidacy. One of the most remarkable elements of the speech was that he directly confronted the historical memory of slavery, pointing out that although the nation was founded on the principle of equality and liberty, it was also founded on the principle of enslavement. He returned to the stain of slavery and its legacy numerous times throughout the speech. In doing so, he challenged the core meaning of the nation and urged the citizens of this country to not be afraid of having an open dialogue about the meaning of race and slavery in America's historical past and its current living moment. There have been various responses to the speech, but one in particular addresses Senator Obama's notion of America's original sin and its lasting legacy. In response to the senator, Patrick Buchanan said, quote, "America has been the best country on earth for black folks. It was here that 600,000 black people brought from Africa in slave ships grew into a community of 40 million, were introduced to Christian salvation, and reached the greatest levels of freedom and prosperity blacks have ever known," end quote. How can one say that slavery and race are not contested issues in American society today? Such incidents remind us that the nation has not moved into a post-racial state. It is not a colorblind society, no matter how many public intellectuals argue as such. And Professor Blight's work is required reading to begin to allow anyone to understand how such a notion has come to dominate American society in the 20th and 21st centuries. With his new work and the subject of his talk this evening, Professor Blight moves us into a discussion of that moment of emancipation during and following the Civil War, and what the meaning of that moment was for the formerly enslaved and the nation as a whole. He does it deftly and exquisitely by reconstructing the histories of 2 former slaves, John Washington and Wallace Tournage, whose autobiographical manuscripts have only recently been rediscovered. A Slave No More is a human story, a history of two men trying to find freedom, define it for themselves, and carve out a space for themselves in the reconstructed nation. As Blight explains, both men had so much to forget in order to build their new lives. And in doing so, he argues, they produced two extraordinary acts of remembering. This evening, we will hear about these two extraordinary acts and the meaning of emancipation. It is my pleasure to introduce a friend, a mentor, and a tremendous scholar. Please help me welcome Professor David W. Blight.
Man, it's daunting to be introduced by your former student. I've been holding my breath sitting there. Thank you, Sean. And thank you to Jonathan Earl and the Robert Dole Center. What a magnificent space. Those of you in the back seem like you're out at the the end of the universe. You can hear me, I can almost see you. It's wonderful also to be in Lawrence, Kansas, and I have to confess for the first time, but I've already got my first John Brown t-shirt thanks to Jonathan. It's the one with John Brown with a beer and the bottle of JB in one hand. Indeed. And it's also, I must say, been wonderful to renew old friendships with some of the terrific faculty you have here at Kansas. I'm going to talk mostly tonight about this new book and the two slave narratives that the book tells the story about. But I want to first begin where Sean took us initially. I do think it's useful not only to refer to Senator Obama's recent speech on race, whatever we think of the current campaign, whomever we support or don't. It is a stunning and remarkable speech. I never heard him give it. I haven't even watched it on a video. I guess I saw excerpts, but I've read it closely, and it rewards a reading. I'm not even going to talk about most of that speech. I do think it's a brave speech, risky. It's the only presidential candidate I can remember in my lifetime who at least mouthed the words slave trade, or slavery 6 or 7 times in that speech. But I want to refer to the end of it, the very end of it, which you may not even remember, because it's one of those moments when politicians start to tell a story from the campaign trail. I met so-and-so on the campaign trail, let me tell you about this, and you think, oh, God, here we go, another melodramatic story from the campaign trail. But his isn't just melodramatic. It's the story at the end that he tells of the young white woman. Do you remember it? 23-year-old Ashley Bahia. I think that's the pronunciation. She was his campaign manager in Florence, South Carolina. 23-year-old white girl. And he tells the story about her. He meets her there. She tells him her life story. When she was 9 or 10 years old, her mother got cancer, had to lose her job. They went bankrupt. And how she ate nothing but relish and mustard sandwiches for a year or two because they had no money, no food, no hope. Her mother did survive. And she got into politics in her late teens, and she got excited about Obama. But what he really describes is a meeting, a large meeting in a room that she put together during the South Carolina primary. And Ashley made it her business to invite all these people, mostly black, to this gathering. And Obama describes how they all go around the room and they answer the question, so why are you here, why are you here, why are you here? And he says, not too subtly, most people always name a specific issue. It's about me, right? What do I care about? I want. And it's the way most of us vote, too, don't we? If we really admit it. But then they come to this old black man who's sitting there, and Ashley asks him, so why are you here? And he doesn't name any issue, says Obama. He just says, I'm here because of Ashley. I'm just here because of Ashley. She invited me. Now, I want you to, I know that it is a hokey campaign trail little story on the surface, but I want to compare it to another moment in the masterpiece of African American literature, Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And I want us to think just for a second what Obama is asking us to think about in the kind of reversal that he does of Du Bois's terrible and terrifying metaphor in Chapter 2 of Souls of Black Folk. If you've read Souls of Black Folk, you may remember this metaphor. It's my favorite metaphor in that book, which is one of my favorite books. It comes as Du Bois is describing, circa turn of the 20th century, what the situation of race and race relations are about in the South, on the ground, between black people and white people. 100 years ago now, more than 100. And he says we can see the situation through what Du Bois calls two figures. And then comes this passage, two figures, says Du Bois. Now Du Bois is suggesting that the legacies of slavery, the legacies of emancipation, the legacies of the Civil War and Reconstruction are here in these two people. I quote him, "The one a gray-haired gentleman, whose fathers had quit themselves like men, whose sons lay in nameless graves, who bowed to the evil of slavery because its abolition threatened untold ill to all, who stood at last, in the evening of life, a ruined form, with hate in his eyes." That's the old white planter, the old white slaveholder, broken down, his world gone. And the other, says Du Bois, the other figure, a form hovering dark and mother-like, her awful face black with the mist of centuries, had aforetime quailed at that white master's command, had bent in love over the cradles of his sons and daughters, and closed in death the sunken eyes of his wife. And I, too, at his behest, had laid herself low to his lust, and borne a tawny man-child to the world, only to see her dark boy's limbs scattered to the winds by midnight marauders riding after damned niggers. The other figure, an old black woman, mother, mammy, an old former slave woman, broken down, not knowing where her future is, her world may be gone. But then Du Bois doesn't let up. He says, but no man clasped, he says, these, he says, were the saddest sights of this woeful day. But he says, no man has clasped the hands of these passing figures of the present past, but hating, they went to their long home, and hating, their children's children live today. No one clasped their hands, says Du Bois. Well, the most famous slogan in all of those almost countless blue-gray reunions of Civil War veterans, South and North, from the 1880s on, the oldest slogan in all those reunions was clasping hands across the bloody chasm. That's precisely what Du Bois is referring to. But he says, you know what? There are two other veterans of that war, two other veterans of slavery, two other veterans of this whole experience, and no one clasped their hands. And they hate each other, and their children's children hate each other. Now, I don't know that Obama read that passage before he wrote that speech. In fact, I doubt that he did. We're told he stayed up half the night finishing it, and I doubt he was reading Souls of Black Folk. I'd have recommended it, but he didn't ask. But look what he's done. He's reversed it. We get a young white woman, full of a certain zeal and idealism, comes from a terrible past. She should be at least a Reagan Democrat, if not a right-wing Republican. She should hate her world. She came from poverty. She was poor. She had nothing. She should resent black people, right? I mean, the political culture says she should be one of those resenters that Obama spoke about in that speech. You remember how he talked about the resentments of white people and then the resentments of black people? And then he even talked about a certain set of resentments from a sort of mixed eyes, his own mixed racial eyes. And part of the reversal is the old black man. Instead of the old white man, we get the old black man who says, I'm just here because Ashley invited me. I think Obama was at least trying to suggest that if there's a hope out of this generation's struggle with two figures representing our racial condition, it has to come in a new imagination. And if Douglass was right that what racism is, as Frederick Douglass once said, a diseased imagination, what do you do for disease? You got to find cures. You got to find a way to heal. Okay. Be that as it may, do with it as you wish. If you haven't, though, read the speech. I want to talk tonight about the memory of emancipation primarily, and do it essentially through these two windows of these two remarkable slave narratives that in effect fell into my lap. But think with me just for at least a moment about how we collectively in this country, or how you yourselves, whatever age or generation or educational roots, how did you first learn about the emancipation of the slaves in the Civil War? Through what narrative? Through what angle of vision? Through what story? How do we remember emancipation? A glorious moment? Day of Jubilee? Maybe days of Jubilee? Do we remember emancipation largely through hymns and music? Do we remember emancipation as the first President Bush did? There's a sentence in George Herbert Walker Bush's inaugural address, 1989. I'm maybe the only person who ever bothered to even remember that particular sentence from that speech, and maybe the only one who ever will remember it. But there's a line. It comes right after the section where the first President Bush is talking about how we must put Vietnam behind us. I don't know if you remember that speech, but he spent a fair amount of time on saying, and this was the late 80s, remember? We needed to put Vietnam away, put Vietnam behind us. We didn't quite do it there in the 80s, did we? We perhaps haven't done it yet, but then comes a line, a single sentence where he says, we must remember we are the nation that sent 600,000 of its sons to die rather than have slavery. Now, who wouldn't want to live in that country? A collective sacrifice to free people. Then you think another 20 seconds and you think, wait a second. Approximately half those people died to preserve slavery. So what do we do with that? But no, we've fashioned the story of emancipation into a national triumph. Well, it is, of course. The slaves were freed in the Civil War. Slavery ended. That version of it ended. But look what it took. But suddenly in presidential rhetoric, I know this is inaugural rhetoric, so what do you, I mean, every inaugural speech has sentences written to remember and sentences written to forget, and I expect this one's been forgotten by everybody except me. But note there that emancipation is just, it's everyone's triumph. We all freed the slaves. And there's a second way we remember emancipation. Now, I suspect, I have no data on this, there haven't been any polls on this as far as I know, although I'd like to see some kind of data done on this. I suspect most Americans now, to the extent they learn about fugitive slaves, emancipation of slaves, tend to learn about it through stories of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is the ubiquitous story in children's literature now. Harriet Tubman is one of the greatest heroes in textbooks. That's all fine. In fact, there was a recent study that came out, or a recent survey that was done of, what was the age group, was I think 14 to 18, or was it 12 to 16? Did you see this? The 10 most recognizable American historical figures? Harriet Tubman was number 2, Martin Luther King was number 1, and now I'm forgetting exactly the rest of the order. But that tells us a great deal, of course, about the significance of the King birthday. Every kid in America now is growing up with Martin Luther King Day, and every kid is growing up, I mean, like 90% of these kids named Harriet Tubman. Now that's good, that's fine, but what's Harriet become? I was in my hometown of Flint, Michigan. It wasn't I was just there this year, too, to speak, but I was there a couple years ago. And there in my hometown was a billboard, a huge billboard, Black History Month. Flint, something or other. And it had Harriet Tubman without her name. And that's when I realized, man, she arrived. You don't even need her name anymore. It's like Abraham Lincoln. Everybody knows who Lincoln is. Just use his name. And they use Lincoln to sell everything now, right? Including sleeping pills. Have you seen the sleeping pill commercials for Lincoln? Yeah, Jesus. Or pianos, billiard tables, and Lincoln is used. I don't know what, I mean, Harriet's being used to sell things. But there she was. Harriet Tubman is just common coin. Aunt Harriet. I'm sorry, forgive me. I'm in a Republican Party palace here, I realize. And Reagan's right over there. I've never given a lecture with Reagan but one of my favorite lines from Ronald Reagan, speaking of Harriet Tubman, and Martin Luther King, this is relevant. On the day Ronald Reagan signed the Martin Luther King birthday into law in the Rose Garden, with Coretta King right behind him and numerous leaders of the civil rights movement right behind her, somebody put a speech in his hand where he said, "We must remember Martin Luther King because, like Harriet Tubman, he was a great proponent of law and order." Harriet Tubman? She broke every law that a woman from the eastern shore of Maryland could conceivably break. She was an underground revolutionary. She carried a rifle. But we have cleaned up emancipation. We've cleaned up fugitive slaves. We've made them billboard figures. And that may be all to the better at some point. Who knows? Or do we remember emancipation, as we, of course, do here in the Academy, because we're serious? Do we remember emancipation as part of that vast, terrible, violent, chaotic Civil War, a process of a social, political revolution, the result in part of a presidential policy and therefore a military policy designed to surely defeat the South, but also to free people? Emancipation Proclamation is not just a ruse. Malcolm X was wrong about that. It was a real thing. Once Lincoln put it in place, he never turned back. Do we remember emancipation? This is where I think our collective public memory is way behind the kinds of things we write. And usually public memory is far behind scholarly writing, and sometimes maybe that's as it should be. We can debate that. But generally, I suspect we remember emancipation not as the essential root of America's second founding. Let's face it, if the Civil War and Reconstruction, as so many scholars now write, scholars of Reconstruction write this, scholars of the Civil War write, Jim McPherson, Eric Foner, and a host of others that have been so influenced by them, all now tend to refer to the Civil War and Reconstruction as our second American Revolution, or as our second founding. And if there is a second founding, a rebirth of an American Republic, as Lincoln calls it in the Gettysburg Address, and as Frederick Douglass called it in his Mission of the War speech umpteen times in 1863 and 64, then what caused the second founding? No emancipation? No 13th Amendment. No emancipation? No 14th Amendment. No emancipation? No 15th Amendment. No 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment? No second founding. The second founding of the United States is deeply intertwined with the liberation of 4 million slaves. But how do we remember it? Where do we put emancipation? Do we know how to talk about it? Well, part of the reason we have a struggle with this, of course, is this long history we had that Sean was hinting at. This long history we've had of the ways in which the lost cause tradition, the Confederate legend, if you like, gained control over our national historical memory, and not just of Southerners, but of Northerners as well, and Westerners as well. There was a young African-American college president named Joseph Price. Brilliant young man, according to Du Bois. Du Bois has a few lines about him in Soul's Black Folk. He was the president of Livingston College in Salisbury, North Carolina. He died rather young, so we didn't hear a great deal about him after this. But in 1890, in a speech, he said this: "The South was more conquered than it was convinced in the Civil War. It was overpowered rather than fully persuaded. The Confederacy surrendered its sword at Appomattox, but it did not there surrender its convictions." And the convictions of the Confederacy is what a memory of emancipation and a memory of slavery and a memory of black freedom have always been working against. But let's now for just a second think about this from the perspective of blacks themselves. And John Washington and Wallace Tournage struggled with this the rest of their lives in ways I can't surely know, given what I was able to find out about them. But for African Americans in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, into the turn of the 20th century and into the 20th century, how should they have remembered their freedom? Where did they put it in the narrative they said they were living in? Was it just easy for them to have Emancipation Day celebrations, sing great spirituals and sing great songs and talk about the day of Jubilo and just go home happy? Should they embrace, I'm talking about the late 19th century now, should they have embraced or should they have rejected the nation that they helped to preserve and reinvent? Especially since by the 1880s and 1890s, that nation was rejecting them. Should they have celebrated their past or lamented it and not looked back? Was the past a safe place to go if you were a black American in 1890? Or was it a dangerous place to go? Should they fight the lost cause and segregation and Jim Crow and all that flowed from it? Or should they retreat into group self-development? Should they have reminded the country of their enslavement or just not bring it up? Who wanted to be the descendant of a slave by 1900 as part of one's identity in a society that was always talking about progress and always themselves talking about the progress of the race? Should they follow Booker T. Washington's narrative of slavery, his principal metaphor, and up from slavery, the greatest post-Civil War slave narrative of all, certainly the largest selling? Booker Washington's principal metaphor for slavery was that of a school. It was a learning experience, a place to learn hygiene, among other things, and economic striving, and about life. Or should they have remembered slavery through Frederick Douglass's principal metaphors in his autobiographies before the Civil War? Douglass's principal metaphor for slavery, and he used it in various ways, was a prison. Prison house was his favorite way of putting it. Does it in the first narrative, does it in the second narrative, does it in the third narrative. Prison or a school? Pat Buchanan appears to believe it was a school. I had not heard that quote, and I watched that fellow on MSNBC, I confess, almost every night. He gets paid to do this. Well, it's Douglass who once said about memory, his words, "Memory," he said, "was given to man for some wise purpose. The past," said Douglass, "is the mirror in which we may discern the dim outlines of our future and by which we may therefore make it more symmetrical." Now that's all lovely and true. The past is a mirror, right, that we want to look into. And it gives us a more symmetrical path to our future. It shows us a way to a future. But what happens when you look in the mirror and it's confusing, or it's vexing, or it's terrifying? What do you do then? Memory is a difficult thing, isn't it? Let me dwell on it just a moment, and then I'll get to my two narratives. I wrote a long book on Civil War memory, and I can't seem to get the memory problem out of my craw or my memory. I don't have a memory anymore. I just study it. It turns out sometimes to be easier to study memory than it is to have one. You all understand memory perfectly as an individual phenomenon, don't we? Right? Can't find your car after this if you don't have a memory. Where are my keys? Where does my class meet? How often are we asked, what room does your class meet in? I don't know the number. I just know where to go. Individual. We can't function without memory, and it's why the absence of it is terrifying. It's why Alzheimer's is so horrifying. It's when we think of memory in a collective sense, as I've been suggesting here, when we begin to try to figure out how to collectively discern the past, organize its stories into a narrative, and then compete like the Dickens in our political culture to control that story. That's collective memory. That's historical memory. And we do it every day. We do it in our politics, we do it in our schooling, we do it in museums, we do it at the Dole Center, we do it at the New York Historical Society, we do it everywhere the past matters. We are struggling, fighting to control a narrative, a story, the past. Now, how many times, if you're a historian here, though, have you been asked by somebody, often in a public setting, but sometimes within the academy, from our own students who will say, when are you just going to decide what really happened? And, settle this. So the South seceded in 1860 and 61. Isn't there just a single explanation? And, of course, we're trained to, we're professors of ambiguity, right? Memory, though, it's that thing you can't live with, but you can't live without it. One of the best things I've ever read, one of the most moving and powerful things I've ever read on memory, is one of the oldest. It's in St. Augustine's Confessions, 3rd century A.D. Augustine has about a 40-page meditation in that magnificent book on the nature of memory. And in some ways he's terrified about the more he thinks about memory, because he knows God knows his memory, and that's what's really got Augustine concerned. Because Augustine has committed a lot of sins. He calls memory at one point the vast court in our mind. He calls it the treasury of the mind. He stands in awe of it. He calls it our chamber in our soul. And then he says, quote, "No one has sounded the bottom thereof." Great is the power of memory, Augustine writes, a fearful thing. Oh my God, a deep and boundless manifoldness. And this thing is the mind, and this am I myself. It's Augustine's way of saying, frankly, quite directly, we are our memories. They dictate to us, we respond to them, and then we endlessly revise them. Memory can control us. It can overwhelm us. It can even poison us if we have too much. Or it can sometimes save us from confusion and despair. How often have you learned something, maybe about your own family history? That's where it all begins, doesn't it? How often have you learned something, and at first, or maybe it's about your collective past, at first you think, oh God, I didn't want to know that. Oh, no, really? Oh, he's one of my heroes. Say it ain't so. But then the more you think on it and the more you read, you think, oh, it's probably better that I know it. It's like, don't meet your hero, right? Because you're going to find out they're real people. I once ran into Al Kaline in an airport. I grew up a Detroit Tigers fan. I still am. Al Kaline was my hero. He was God. He was God in right field. I was about 28. He was the end of his career. And I ran into him in an airport, and he was smoking a cigarette. Oh, it hurt. You know what I did? I went up and asked for his autograph. I was 28 years old. Don't meet your hero. couple other thoughts on this. You know, I've been reading a lot of writers and philosophers and poets about memory, forgive me. When in doubt, go read Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote about everything in the universe. He wrote a little essay on memory. It's called Memory. And in it, Emerson says, we tend to remember most those things that we hate and those things that we love. Love experiences. A first love. Maybe a second love. A mother's love. A brother's love. Love of place. Love of school. Love of university. Love of home. You know, there's some things at the love end of that you don't forget, or you keep refashioning them so that you don't forget them. And on the other end, hatred. I'll never forget what your people did to my people in the year 712, you know. Remember we got involved in Kosovo, and Americans were wondering, well, why are these people going to war over something that happened in the 8th century? What's the matter with these people? Can't they forget anything? And then there's Faulkner. No one in American writing ever probed the deep, dark corners of the problem of the memory of slavery, race, and the Civil War and Reconstruction in the Southern mind, but by definition, the American mind, quite like Faulkner. There's a sentence, a single sentence that he puts in the mouth of one of his characters in the novel, The Hamlet. It's one of the Snopes. There are a lot of Snopes, and I forget which one. But he has one of the Snopes say in that novel at one point, quote, only thank God men have done learned how to forget quick what they ain't brave enough to try to cure. Can't cure that problem. Don't know what to do about it. It's intractable. It's ancient. Let's forget it. Let's go to the game. And then there's Mark Twain, who left this warning to anybody dealing with memory. It was Twain who said, when I was a young man, I remembered everything, whether it happened or not. But now that I'm an old man, I remember only the things that never happened. Make it up. Okay, enough of that. Let me tell you what happened here. This was a historian's dream. This isn't supposed to happen. Two remarkable, extraordinarily rare manuscripts fall into your lap in the same 6-month period, and you get to work with them, do research on them, and publish them. That's one of those daydreams you have in graduate school, you know. For my third book someday, maybe, just maybe, 2 slave narratives will fall in my lap. Yeah. That's exactly what happened in 2003. Let me explain how the two came to me, tell a little bit of the story of each man, how we got these documents at all, and a little bit about their post-war lives, to try to describe what a research challenge this became. The first was brought to me by a literary agent. Her name is Wendy Strothman, who is now my agent and a very close friend. Wendy lives in Boston. She was working on behalf of the manuscript's owner. Wendy brought it to me in early 2003. She was simply looking for a historian of slavery and slave narratives who might work with the document and possibly try to publish it. The owner of the document is a man named Julian Houston, who lives in Boston. He's an African-American judge, now retired judge. He also happens to be a novelist. He had written 2 novels with Wendy. That's how they knew one another. Fascinating man. His 2 novels are about growing up in segregation in the South. And Julian gave her the manuscript and said, or gave her a copy of it and said, would you find someone who might work with this? At first, I did next to nothing with it. I was in the process of moving from one job to another. I was moving to Yale University. My life was in boxes. In fact, for a few weeks, I couldn't even find it. It was in boxes. Wendy would call me, David, are you ever going to read it? I don't know where it is right now. Give me a month, I'll figure out where it is. I moved to Yale. My first month I'm officially at Yale, September of '03. I was invited to give a talk at the Greenwich, Connecticut Historical Society. Fairly small operation. in the richest per capita town in the United States. I'm sitting at dinner with the Historical Society's owner, Deborah Mecke, and I'm to speak to her board on historical memory. And Deborah leans over and says, "My staff thinks we have an authentic slave narrative manuscript. Would you care to have a look at it and maybe help us see what we could do with it?" And I said something stupid to her, like, "Another one? Where are you New Englanders growing these things? How did you get this? What is it?" She gave me a photocopy. I took it home. And to make a long story short, I sat down with the two of them, each of which was about 100 to 120 pages in manuscript form as they were written. And I realized very quickly what I had, if I could authenticate them, and that turned out to be the easiest part. I had two post-Civil War, post-emancipation autobiographies by former slaves, one from Virginia and one who had escaped in Alabama. One written in 1873 because he dates it. The other is undated, but probably written in the 1880s, in my judgment. Neither of which was ever published, nor was, from the research I've done, was there ever any attempt by either man to publish them. And in both cases, they told largely the story of how they escaped, of their emancipation in the midst of the Civil War. Now, a little bit about each man's story, and then I want to circle back to tell you how these documents actually survived. One is pretty much a box in the attic story, and the other is even better. John Washington was born a slave in 1838 in Fredericksburg, Virginia. His father was white, though he never knew who he was. At least he never told us. And the greatest single frustration in all of this research has been that I've never been able to figure out who his father was. Now, his last name was Washington. Now, if you go looking for Washingtons in the state of Virginia, you've got a problem. There are a lot of Washingtons in Virginia. It is possible he made up his last name. That's one theory. In fact, the chief historian at the Fredericksburg National Military Park, who was a great deal of help to me on this, that's his theory. He thinks John made up his last. He's decided, I'll be a Washington. I'm in Virginia. Why not? Don't know. If he ever knew who his father was, he didn't tell us. I have a few candidates, but I can't prove it. His mother was a slave woman named Sarah, later Sarah Tucker. His mother was literate, because John tells us he first learned his alphabet and his letters from his mother, which makes him lucky and quite remarkable, although not as remarkable in a town or a city as it would have been, say, in the Cotton Belt. He grows up largely in Fredericksburg. He was obviously skilled, talented, brilliant young guy. By the time he's a teenager, his owner, who by then in the 1850s was a woman named Mrs. Tolliver, she hires him out about 5 times before he escaped in 1862. He gets hired out at one point to a local family. He works for him for a year as their jack of all trades. He gets hired out to a tavern. He was hired out to a tobacco factory for a full year, which, by the way, he loved working in. It's a beautiful little section of the narrative. He describes how he loved the tobacco factory because he came to love the routine of the place. Now, you and I might think, you got to be kidding. 14 hours a day being a twister of tobacco in a dank, stinking tobacco factory. But he said he loved the routine. He's about 17 then, because he had spent his childhood years, or much of those childhood years, into his teenage years, always at the beck and call of Mrs. Tolliver. When he was like 10 to 12, even 13 years old, she would force him to follow her around all day with a little stool, and he'd have to sit down within eyeshot of her, so she would always know where he was, all day, every day. And sometimes in the narrative, he'll describe one of those scenes and turn it into a metaphor of slavery and freedom. There's one scene where he's 10 or 12, and he's sitting in a room with an open window on a glorious spring day like this. Flowers are out. He sees a couple of his buddies playing down in the Rappahannock River. He can smell the flowers and hear the birds. And he converts that into slavery and freedom. He says, out that window was freedom. Slavery was me on my chair. He also loved the tobacco factory because for the first time he heard slave work songs. He'd heard the spirituals at the African Baptist Church, but he never heard these work songs. And he liked them. He loved the rhythm and the chant of them. In the late 1850s, John also fell in love. He fell crazy in love. He met a girl named Annie Gordon. She was 4 years younger. He met her at church. She was free, a young, free black girl. Not unusual in a town like Fredericksburg. And we know he fell crazy in love because one of his love letters survives. And I know he wrote many more because he refers to them. And frankly, folks, we have precious few love letters by slaves. This is a 3-page, incredible letter. It could have been written last night on the Kansas campus. I love you. I can't wait to see you. I want to marry you. I saw you with so-and-so. I'm yearning for you. I burn for you. And so on and so on. We also know because he kept a diary. About 18 pages of fragments of a diary have survived. I don't know how. And I'd give almost anything to have more of that diary, because we have, so far as I know, this is unprecedented, we have no such diaries by slaves. And it's mostly the diary of his courtship of Annie. I saw her with so-and-so, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I can't wait to see her. We danced, on and on and on. But it's just fragments that have survived somehow down through the family. Well, to cut to the chase, John was biding his time, and he will choose his moment to escape at the first moment that the Union Army arrives on the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg, and that is April of 1862. He had been hired out the previous year down to Richmond, where he worked in a saloon, or a tavern, and this time, in the spring of 1862, he was hired out to a hotel in Fredericksburg. And by the way, he was always able to keep a little money from these hirings out. At one point, he says it was about $30 that he'd managed to save. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but it would have been a lot in 1862. But the Union Army did indeed arrive on the Rappahannock on the 18th of April, 1862. And at that point, John was working in a hotel called the Shakespeare. I kid you not. That's the place. His job at the Shakespeare was working as a steward and almost like an assistant manager. Again, a measure of how skilled and talented he was. The owner of the place gave John regularly a wad of cash to pay off all the help. But at this point, all the white folks, including the owner of the hotel, were fleeing the city. They were evacuating. In fact, he even names the Confederate regiment that the owner of the hotel was about to join. And we looked that up, and sure enough, he got that right. And he has this remarkable scene where he describes all the white people evacuating the city, April 18th, 1862. And he takes the dozen or so black workers of the hotel, most of whom are slaves, up to the roof of the hotel so they can see across the river and see what he describes as the gleam of the Yankees' bayonets. And then he brings them all back down into the kitchen of the hotel and he pours a round of drinks. And he lifts a toast, and the toast was to the Yankees. And then he sort of instructs his fellow slaves. He says to them, in effect, get out of here, but don't get too far from the Yankees. And then John walked 2 blocks down to the river. He witnessed the official surrender of Fredericksburg. He witnessed the 2 bridges being burned by the Confederates. And then with his cousin, he simply walked about a mile upriver, northwest. And he tells us he went in the direction of the sound of the Union bands. And he tells us that he crossed the river at Ficklen's Mill, and the old stone ruins of the Ficklen's Mill are still there, so I know exactly where he crossed the river. He crossed the river in a rowboat, and he was officially freed by a captain in the 20th New York Volunteers whose name was Ladd, L-A-D-D, who interrogated him briefly, including the question, would you like to be free? That's the way John describes it. To which he answered in the narrative, he says, my answer was, yes! Excuse me. He slept that night in a free black woman's side room. And then John will spend the rest of that summer, the summer of 1862, as a camp servant and occasionally a guide on horseback for the Union Army all over northern Virginia, right on up through the Battle of Second Manassas, the last 2 days of August, 1860, the terrible disaster of Second Manassas for the Union armies. And he dates his arrival in Washington, D.C. as part of that first major wave of freedmen as September 1, 1862. Now, I know at first that he lived in the streets and that he worked in in hospitals, because Washington, D.C., at that very moment he arrives, is one gigantic hospital. They turned the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol into a giant hospital. I find my first evidence of him at an address at the end of 1863. He was living on 19th Street at the address of what is today Constitution Hall, which is about 3 blocks southwest of the White House. I find him in the next year's city directory with his wife Annie, their firstborn child, his mother Sarah, and his 68-year-old grandmother Molly, she herself mother of 8 children, living in Washington, D.C. How he got them all out, I can't be sure, but there they are. He and Annie will raise 5 sons. They will live in Washington most of the rest of their lives. He will live in Washington until 1913, at which point he retired. He became, by the way, a commercial painter, a house painter. And every city directory, census manuscript, church record, Freedmen's Bank record, everything I found, from 1865 on, he's listed as painter or commercial painter. But on his obituary, he's listed as retired sign painter. He moved up. He and Annie were among the 400 freedmen and free blacks from Fredericksburg who founded the Shiloh Baptist Church. They call it New Shiloh in Washington, D.C., because Old Shiloh was in Fredericksburg. And I know that he and Annie went on excursions that the Shiloh Church organized back to Virginia in the 1870s and 1880s. A little more on John in a moment. The other narrative is written by Wallace Tournage. Wallace was born in 1846. He's 8 years younger than John Washington. He was born on a little tobacco farm near Snow Hill, North Carolina, Greene County, North Carolina. A very little place. Snow Hill to this day has only 2 traffic lights. There's a little mall out there. I guess there's a third one. His father was also white. He knew exactly who his father was. He put his father's name on every document the rest of his life, although I don't think he ever knew him. His father's name was Sylvester Brown Tournage. Sylvester Brown Tournage moved out of that county and married a white woman when Wallace was only 3 years old. And by the way, Sylvester Brown Tournage was 18 when Wallace was born, and his mother, Courtney, later Courtney Hart, was 15. You can figure that out, of what was going on. Wallace also tells us that his mother was literate. Both of these guys were extraordinarily lucky to have literate mothers. He tells us that he at least first learned his alphabet from his mother. But he is sold at the age of 13 in early 1860 by his indebted owner to a Richmond, Virginia slave trader whose name was Hector Davis. And all through Wallace's narrative, and thank God he did because he helped me out, he names names. He names addresses. He names people. He names towns. He even names distances, which I'm convinced he worked with some maps before he ever sat down to write. But at any rate, he sold to Richmond in early 1860, consider the year. And Hector Davis, the slave trader he was sold to, was one of the richest domestic slave traders in the United States, one of the 2 biggest in Richmond. He owned a 3-story slave auction house and jail at 14th and Franklin Streets in Richmond, about 3 blocks down from that magnificent Virginia Capitol. He also kept enormous records, and one of Hector Davis's gigantic account books survives. It sits today in the Chicago Historical Society. It was taken there by an Illinois regiment that confiscated it when Richmond fell in 1865. That's how it got to Chicago. But by examining those account books, I was able to determine, and I'll save you most of the statistics, But Hector Davis, between 1857 and 1860, when he buys and sells Wallace, averaged between $15,000 and $18,000 in sales of slaves per week. That's an average. He had one day in 1859 when he sold approximately $130,000 worth of slaves, about 95 people for $130-some thousand. That's his biggest sale of a single day ever. This was extremely lucrative business. If you haven't learned much about the domestic slave trade, it's worth reading about. And there's a great set of 2 or 3 recent books on that, one by Walter Johnson. Well, Wallace's job at Hector Davis's auction house for about 6 months was preparing the slaves in what was called the dressing room to take them out to the auction floor, cleaning them up, rubbing scars, preparing them. And then one day Wallace is told, "Boy, you're in the auction." And just like that, he was sold to an Alabama cotton planter whose name was James Chalmers. And 72 hours later, by train, he found himself on a large cotton plantation near Pickens Ville, Alabama, about 80 slaves and a sadistic overseer. Pickens Ville is in central west Alabama, right on the Mississippi border. Most of Wallace Tournage's narrative is the story of his 5 attempts to escape, most of them in the midst of the Civil War, until he finally succeeded in August of 1864 in Mobile, Alabama, and indeed into Mobile Bay. I'll spare you all the details of Wallace's first 4 runaways, except to say each time he ran away the first 4 times, he always ran over into Mississippi and then north. And he always followed what was called the Mobile and Ohio Railway line. It's still called that. He was trying to get to northern Mississippi or into Tennessee, although when asked where he was trying to go, several times he answers, according to his testimony, he says, "I'm just trying to go home." Well, what would home have been to this 14, 15, 16-year-old kid? It probably still meant North Carolina or his mother. He had no hope of ever getting home, but where he was really trying to get to was the Union Army. The Union armies occupied the whole northern tier of Mississippi by early 1862, and he was also trying to get to what by 1862, late 1862, was the largest contraband camp anywhere in the South. It was in Corinth, Mississippi, right up in the northeast corner. It had approximately 6,000 freedmen living in this giant tent city. It wasn't even tents after a while. They built log cabins. They even had named streets. They even formed a full black regiment of infantry in that contraband camp. In 62 and 63, it was known as the 1st Alabama Volunteers of the Union Army. It's because all the guys were from Alabama. Wallace never quite made it. Even on his 4th try, when he was at large, according to his testimony, for about 4.5 months, he would hide in gullies and fence rows and other slaves' cabins and wherever he could hide. He always gets betrayed or he always gets caught. And does he get punished? His story is essentially, as I call it in the book, a kind of tunnel of horrors. He's put in neck braces, ankle chains, wrist chains. At one point he was thrown into a fireplace with a full fire in it by the bounty hunter who had captured him, who got drunk as a skunk one night and tried to kill him. He gets badly burned. Another time he was chained by the wrist to another fugitive slave for 3 or 4 days in a row, and they had to drag each other around and live in each other's filth and so forth. Well, but every time he ran, old man Chalmers always came after him. And the reason, of course, was that Wallace was so valuable. The first time Wallace was sold out of North Carolina, he was sold for $995 to Hector Davis. When Hector Davis sold him to Chalmers, he was sold for $1,000. Chalmers finally retrieved him on this 4th attempt. And when he's bringing him back to Pickens Ville, Wallace tells us of a scene. I can't be certain if this happened, of course, as the student of his autobiography, but it surely could have. He tells of a scene where they run into a Confederate patrol, and the Confederate soldiers, I don't know whether they'd been drinking or not, they decided they were going to use him for sport. They roped him to a tree, and they were about to use him for target practice. And Chalmers, his owner, begs these guys, don't kill him, don't shoot him, don't shoot him. He's so valuable. I'm going to take him to Mobile and sell him, please. And so they let him go. And sure enough, about 2 days later, Chalmers took him by train down to Mobile in the spring of 1863 and sold him for $2,000 at the Mobile, Alabama slave jail. Now, that would have been Confederate money, so we can't be exactly sure what that was worth. But the rest of his narrative is the story of first his more than a year, about 15 months residence in Mobile. He was purchased by a wealthy merchant, a man named Collier Minge. Minge was a real person, I can assure you. Even Minge's house is even still there. Wallace didn't make up anybody's name. One of the jobs he had working for the Minge family was to drive their carriage. And one day in the first week of August 1864, he crashed the master's carriage. The harness breaks, the horse gets away, the carriage breaks. He goes home, and his master is so angry at him that he drags him down to the slave jail, hires the jailer, which was a common practice. In fact, these notices appeared in the Mobile newspaper. So-and-so brought such and such slave to jail for so many lashes and paid such and such. Wallace was stripped naked, strung up on a wall by his wrist, and given 30 lashes with this god-awful contraption that was guaranteed to split your flesh on every whipping. At the end of it, he's standing there bloodied, and his master says, "Walk home." But instead of walking home, Wallace simply walked out of Mobile. He walked right through 10,000 Confederate troops. The garrison of Mobile at that point, August of '64, was huge. And he walked out at dusk. And no doubt he was simply mistaken for yet another black camp hand, of which there would have been hundreds around any Confederate army. The slaves, after all, had built all the fortifications around Mobile, 3 layers of them. And the last tale in his narrative, it's the most dramatic part of it, and you can just feel the tension on the page as this guy who is literate but struggles to write, trying to capture what he went through. The rest of his narrative is a 3-week trek down the western shore of Mobile Bay for approximately 25 miles through the snake and alligator-infested swamps of what's known as the Foul River Estuary. And I spent an entire day doing a ferry boat ride all over the Foul River Estuary. And it's beautiful. I mean, it's a gorgeous swamp. And it's got alligators. And it's got snakes. And how he survived it and traversed it, I don't know. He nearly starved. He describes the only food he can find are cantaloupe patches and berries and such. He finally reaches out to the point of the mouth of Mobile Bay. He spent the last 3 or 4 days or so playing a cat and mouse game with Confederate lookouts. They had built up in a tree or something what he calls a spy house. And they would come out by day from their camp, and they'd go up there and they'd be the lookouts. But at dusk, they'd always come down and go back to their camp. He'd go up, they'd come back. He'd go up, they'd come back. They'd do this for 3 or 4 days. He said he always listened for the clang of their boots and their uniforms and their rifles. When he heard them coming, he would scamper back down into his little den in the swamp. And then he describes how he says, "One day I prayed especially hard, and the tide that morning brought in an old rowboat, apparently a rowboat with holes in it. He said, I grabbed a plank of wood, and I just started rowing out into Mobile Bay. And Mobile Bay is the ocean. And trust me, you don't take a rowboat into Mobile Bay." But he did, in his desperation and probably starvation. And of course, then comes his most dramatic moment, like John Washington's moment of his fellow slaves and having a toast, or the moment he describes his first night in freedom. Wallace describes how a huge wave is about to swamp his boat, of course. It gets fairly romantic, a white-capped wave. And he's bailing his boat, by the way, because it's about to capsize. And he says, "I heard oars." And the oars he heard were a Union gunboat with 8 sailors in it. And they shout to him, "Jump in, boy." And he said, "I waited for the rhythm of the 2 boats, and I jumped in." And then he sits down. He says, "I looked at the sailors, and they looked at me." And then he says, "The Yankee sailors looked at me and were struck silent." Now, Again, I don't know if that happened, but I believe him. They rode him to a Sand Island fort. They clothed him, fed him, wrapped him in blankets. He slept in a tent overnight. The first acts of kindness by white people in his life of 17 years. The next day they rode him to Dauphin Island, which is the huge, beautiful sandbar island out at the mouth of Mobile Bay. They took him to Fort Gaines, which is still there. I wouldn't even call those ruins. Fort Gaines is still there. And somewhere in that courtyard of Fort Gaines, on what was probably August 27th or 28th, and I could explain later if anyone cares how I was able to figure out the date, he was interrogated by a general named Gordon Granger. Granger was the Union commander of all Union forces in the Mobile region. And the reason Granger probably interrogated him, at least briefly, was because he was a fugitive from Mobile. They wanted intelligence about Mobile. That's where they were going to go next. And Granger gave him two choices. The first was that he could join a black regiment, and Granger was himself involved at that point in trying to form two new black regiments from all over the Gulf region. His second choice was he could become a servant to a white officer. And Wallace chose the latter. Doesn't really says why. Perhaps because he'd had enough suffering. He served out the war as the mess cook for a captain named Junius Turner from a Maryland Union regiment. I learned a lot about Junius Turner because he lived to be 100 years old and he has a huge pension file. He was always writing to the government and bitching for more money. He lived until about 1935. Turnage's narrative frustratingly ends after these dramatic scenes he describes with a rather speedy, brief narrative of how he's with this Maryland regiment when they took Mobile in April of 1865, and then he says he was with this regiment guarding Confederate prisoners over in New Orleans, and the war ended. And then he puts a stunning page and a half sort of spiritual ending on the book, and then he puts the words, "the end." I mean, you want to grab him and say, no, what happened to you? Who are you? Where did you go? Why did you stop? Now, in Wallace Tournage's case, the way we got this document is this, quite simply. Tournage will spend the next 3 years in Baltimore. He was probably with that regiment in August of 65 when they were mustered out in Baltimore. I know that he lived till 1868 in Baltimore. Sometime in those 3 years, he went back to Greene County, North Carolina, and he retrieved his mother and his 4 half-siblings. Because by 1870, I found them in a census manuscript living in the 300 block of Thompson Street in what you and I today call Greenwich Village in New York City. His mother, Courtney, was there with him. She will live until 1890, and she will die in the 200 block of West 60th Street, and a location that is today Lincoln Center. Her house isn't there. Wallace will live all over Lower Manhattan for 11 years at numerous addresses, including on Minetta Lane, the most notorious street in southern Manhattan, made famous by Jacob Riis and how the other half lived. He will marry 3 times. First 2 wives died. He'll have 7 children, only 3 of whom lived out of infancy. He had 4 children die in infancy, most of them of tuberculosis. He moved in about 1880 across the Hudson to Jersey City, New Jersey, and he will live out his life there until 1916. But he always worked in Manhattan. I found him in city directories, census manuscripts, Freedmen's Bank records, etc., in all kinds of common laborer jobs. He worked as a bartender, a drayman, a night watchman, a glass blower, etc. And I even found him listed once in a city directory as what he himself described as, quote, a general jobber. Now, I didn't know what that meant, And I was writing this book last year in a sabbatical at the New York Public Library, and I went around and asked a bunch of the smart people at the New York Public Library who know everything about New York. I said, what's a general jobber in the 1890s in Manhattan? They said, well, we're not sure. And we had this little mini seminar for a half hour, and the consensus was a general jobber is the guy on the street. He might have a cart, and he buys things from people and sells them to other people. That's a general jobber. He was also a nearly 30-year member of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, the original Abyssinian, and he became a longtime member of a black fraternal order called the Hamilton Lodge of Oddfellows, and he is buried today in Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, in the collective burial plot of that Hamilton Lodge fraternal order. And a man took me just last Sunday for the first time to find that corner of the plot where Wallace is actually buried. Wallace had one daughter. She is how we get the document. It's a remarkable story. Her name was Lydia Tournage Connolly. Lydia lived to be 99. She first married an African-American man in the 1920s. She divorced him. Don't know the real story. Why? She married again in the 1940s to an Italian immigrant, an Irish immigrant named Thomas Connolly. That's not Italian. She and Tom Connolly moved to Greenwich, Connecticut to work as domestics in a rich people's hotel, a hotel called, I always forget this, the Pickwick Arms. It's still there. She was a maid, and he was a maintenance guy. She outlived him. She died in a nursing home in 1984, 99 years old. She had one friend left in the world. Her name was Gladys Watts, and Mrs. Watts is actually still alive. And Mrs. Watts kept one box of material from Lydia, just one box. It isn't even the size of this lectern. And she kept it for 18 years, until early 2003. She watched a public television documentary called Unchained Memories, which is the film about the WPA oral history narratives from the 1930s. Fine film, by the way, if you ever get a chance to see. She watched this film, and as the people at the Greenwich Historical Society told me, she called them up the next day or shortly thereafter and said, I may have something that will interest you. They sent someone out, and they said, yes, you do. The only thing in the box, kept in a black clamshell box. And by clamshell, I mean it had a top you took off and on that fit perfectly down onto the narrative, as though the box had been made for it. He wrote it in a leather-bound, blue paper-lined stationery book that he bought at a stationery shop in Lower Manhattan. It still has the insignia of the shop on it. About 120 pages in his own hand. The only other thing in the box, this is all we had to go on to start, were 5 photographs. 4 of them of Wallace himself, and they're all in the book, that he had taken in studios. What does the working class do? It dresses up in its finest Sunday suits, and he had 4 different photos of himself taken at different times in his life. I'm guessing the first one's about 1880, and the last one's probably at least 1900, or maybe older. And he dressed up for those photos. He may be a general jobber, but not in the studio photos. And the other photo in there is a photo of Lydia when she was about 18 years old. Beautiful photo of this sad-faced girl. That's it. That's where we had to start. Now, let me just end with this. For me, this was a new research challenge. I'd never done genealogy before, and I want to give most of the credit for this to my research assistant, whose name is Christine McKay. I had the great good fortune to connect to Christine through, actually, first the Greenwich Historical Society. Christine McKay is an archivist at the Schomburg Library of the New York Public Library in Harlem. She is a genius at genealogy, and she taught me how to do it. And with Chris's help, we began to try to locate these 2 men, to uncover whatever we could, whatever shreds of information we could get about particularly their post-war lives, but also their earlier lives. And among our finds, in the case of John Washington, by cranking in Fredericksburg newspapers, I found a runaway ad for John Washington's mother when he was 3. Sarah, 21 or 22 years old, high yellow complexion, short in height, owned by Thomas R. Ware, Jr. Thomas R. Ware, Jr. only owned 4 slaves, one of whom was named Sarah, about 21 years of age. She ran away when her son was 3, and she was clearly at large long enough for there to be a runaway ad in the newspaper, which allowed me to at least speculate in the book. I don't know. Did she ever tell him? Oh, by the way, John, I ran away too when you were 3. I couldn't help wondering, when he gets her to Washington and they're going for a walk around the White House grounds, I mean, they live 3 blocks from there, did she ever just stop and say, John, we were both runaways? I don't know. Possibly she didn't want to look back. Don't know. And one other quite remarkable find, there are many others, but we always knew there was no likelihood of any descendants, living descendants, of Wallace Tournage, because all 3 of his surviving children died childless. His family really had a rough time, and I won't go into all of that. But in the John Washington case, we knew the 5 sons, we knew all the names of their children, we knew where they lived, and we knew that John Washington Jr. had 3 daughters, and we knew they lived in northern New Jersey. And my research assistant, Chris, wouldn't give up. And actually, I tried to sort of call her off after a while because I was paying her. But she wouldn't, I haven't paid her that much, but anyway. She kept digging and digging and digging and digging. We had names. She started just reading obituaries in New Jersey newspapers last year. And in a June obituary, there were some names that really clicked. We knew that John Washington Jr. lived in Jersey City. We knew they had 3 daughters. We knew one was named Ruth Washington. And there was a cousin that clicked. And it said one of the descendants was a Ruth Washington, 89 years old, Tampa, Florida. We thought, could be. We started calling Ruth Washingtons in Tampa, Florida. Turns out there are quite a few of them. But I forget, was it the 6th or 7th try? There she was. We found the 89-year-old living granddaughter of John Washington who knew nothing about her grandfather. Nothing. She had been cut off. This takes me back to where we began tonight with this question of the memory of emancipation. She was born in 1918. That's the year John Washington died, so she couldn't have known her grandfather. Her father, John Jr., died when she was 18. She said her father never talked about the past. And when you're a child, you don't exactly run around asking your parents, so tell me about your past, Dad. We don't usually do that, right, until we're 25 or 30 or even older, and then we wish we'd done more. But she said her father, who was thoroughly working class and stable, he worked in a meat packing factory for 30 years, bought his own home, and taught his daughters perfect etiquette. She showed me a photograph when I finally met her of she and her 2 sisters sitting in white gloves at a dining room table, learning etiquette. And she said, my father's greatest value, so far as I understood him, is that he wanted us to get an education. And he got all 3 of his daughters through Hampton University in Virginia. He dies when she's a freshman at Hampton in the 30s. To get young black women into college in the 30s was no simple thing. I had the out-of-body experience as a scholar, a person, to call her in late October last fall and say, I'm about to publish your grandfather's autobiography. What do you know about your grandfather? Nothing. Except I flew down to Tampa. They met me at the airport. She, her daughter, Barbara, who's 71, her granddaughter, Maureen, who's 40. They met me at the airport with Ruth at the wheel. And they took me out to Ruth's favorite restaurant, the Cheesecake Factory at the mall. And we sat for 6 hours and ate cheesecake, shared photographs and stories and so on and so forth. But she showed me one photograph she had. She said, I've always had this photograph, and they told me it was my grandparents' gravestone. But she said, I never knew my grandparents. I knew nothing about it. She said, where is this? I said, I'll take you there. John and Annie Washington are buried in, of all places, Cohasset, Massachusetts. He moved there in 1913 when he retired to live with one of his sons. His name was James. His son James had moved there to take a job on a local railroad, a commuter railroad, and his son did well enough to buy a house. By the way, Cohasset, Massachusetts is an extremely upscale resort town on the ocean, South Shore, Boston, about 20 miles south of Boston. The first mansions on the ocean there went up in the 1890s, built by the leather barons of Boston and Lowell. And today, down the coast, are the McMansions that have gone up in the last 30 years. But there'd always been a little working class there, too. John Washington died in 1918 in his son's house. Never underestimate local historical societies. I decided, well, I got to go find this gravesite. A couple summers ago, I called up to see if there was a Cohasset Historical Society. And of course, there is. It consisted of one little old house and one very old man. But God, was he a big help. I said, you know if this house on 314 North Main by any chance survives? He said, oh, yeah, I know that house. Got a screened porch. I said, how do I find it? He said, go out North Main. Oh, sure. I said, what about this Woodside Cemetery, you know, the so-called working class cemetery where my man was buried? I said, where's that? He said, just keep going out North Main, and it's right there. And sure enough, found the house, found the gravestone. There he was. And then the man said to me, he said, by the way, you know, we just had a big study done of that cemetery by the Massachusetts Humanities Council to determine whether to put it on the National Register of Historic Places. Is there a report? He says, yeah, you want to read it? Sure. I read the report. Long, about six-page report. They didn't pass any of the criteria. You have to have a classic funereal art, you have to be adjacent to a historic district, and you have to have a sufficient number of famous people. And they didn't pass on any one of those three. But in the last paragraph, it said, the most important person buried in this cemetery is a former African-American Union soldier, he'd have appreciated the promotion, named John Washington. And all I could think was, you know, it's finally become cool in the early 21st century to have a former slave buried in your little small-town Massachusetts cemetery. Would that have been the case even 20 years ago? I don't know for sure. A last point. If any of you hang around for the book signing, I'll show you Ruth's picture. I flew Ruth and her daughter and granddaughter up to Fredericksburg last November, and the National Park Service in Fredericksburg helped me put on a special event honoring Ruth Washington, returning to the city of her ancestor. She wore a corsage all day, flowers. She had a local reporter walked around with her all day long interviewing her. We had an incredible celebration in the old Baptist church. They did a reading of the narrative. They did a musical event. I gave a speech. I introduced Ruth, who's about 4'8". We put a box up at the pulpit, and she got up. She whipped out about a 5-page handwritten speech. She's a former teacher, by the way. She's a smart lady. And she got up and she delivered this remarkable speech about what it meant to discover your slave ancestor and what it meant to be cut off from that past. And then she thanked the city of Fredericksburg, the people of Virginia, and she took the house down. Standing ovation, people are weeping, and afterward she sat right next to me at the book signing, and she signed the books, and then I signed the books, and Ruth was author for a night. I guess the point of all of that is never say never. Sometimes the past comes and finds us, even when we're not looking for it. Thank you. I welcome your comments or questions, criticisms. Mariema, I see you. There you are. They want you to use the mic, probably. Oh, are we filming this? Oh, I should have cleaned it up. Thanks for coming, students. Extra credit is always worth it.
Extra points.
Hey, they came. Mariama.
Thank you so much, David. What's so incredible here is you filled so many of the holes that we normally have when we hear these stories. And I'm just amazed at the ability to really put those pieces together. I mean, it was almost, it's a continuous narrative. So there are some holes, though.
Oh, it felt like a very disjointed narrative to me when we were doing it.
But so
I can make it sound like it's not disjointed.
You're a good storyteller, yes. But I am just amazed.
They're very big holes, by the way. There are lots of things I don't know about them. I wish I did.
But this just and as you say, the point is that they were both literate. So the question of authenticity or authorship is resolved. It is these people wrote their own stories. This is not, there's not an amanuensis involved in the process.
Well, as a person in literature, you would understand and appreciate this. One of the dilemmas one has with an autobiography, obviously, all autobiography, even by the famous, is trying to understand, so what can I trust here and what perhaps not trust? And it was one of the fascinating challenges of this. Just a couple of quick examples. In Wallace Tournage's case, as I said, he names people, dates, and so forth and so on. So when he named Hector Davis, that whole world of the slave trade in Richmond opened up to me. And there's a lot of information on Hector Davis. But all those runaways in the Mississippi, well, I started testing his memory. I tested his sense of geography. I tested his sense of the town names, and he names about 15 to 20 different towns in Mississippi that he either goes around or goes through, distances and so on. He's uncannily accurate. Now, I also used, in both cases, when I'm trying to follow John Washington around Northern Virginia in 1862 when he joins the Union Army or he's working for the Union Army, or with Wallace Tournage in Mobile, and then out to the point of his escape, I went to the official record of the War of the Rebellion. Any of you who are Civil War historians know exactly what that is. It's about 40 volumes of the official dispatches on both sides in the war, mostly Union but also Confederate, from the front, day by day by day by day, in every campaign. I was able to find out a great deal about where both of these men were and to test their memories. John Washington mentions the roads they were on, the towns they went through, the dates, the Battle of Culpeper Courthouse, Second Manassas, Groveton, and on and on and on and on and on. The day Fredericksburg was burned by the Confederates. He gives me a date. He was off by a day. But the more and more and more and more you're able to verify their own memories, you not only are establishing authenticity, you're establishing some degree of trust about the narrative. Now, where obviously you can't know is, for example, Wallace loved to embellish a bit some of his escapes, like the one of, I forget which one, but he's over in Mississippi and he's running from dogs. Slave catchers with dogs, right? Terrifying. But he leaps over a ditch and the dogs can't make it over the ditch and the dogs all go in the ditch and he gets away. I don't know. There's a little Keystone Cops quality to some of his escapes. Where I realize, Wallace has got some wit here. I gotta watch him. I gotta watch him. But then I find Collier. He's real. And the jailer and everything about Mobile. Oh, by the way, he joined a Baptist church, Black Baptist church in Mobile. But he got angry because he wanted to be baptized. He thought baptism was just the coolest thing in the world. But the Confederates outlawed outdoor baptisms for the slaves during the war because it was considered too dangerous. Then you can imagine what he does with the metaphor of baptism once he's going through the Fall River estuary. So, and there are a dozen other cases. When John Washington gets to Washington, You know, I'm trying to verify his addresses and his neighborhoods, and then the churches. Shiloh Baptist Church has its own history. And, of course, after 20 years, he leaves Shiloh Baptist. The usual story is a schism over a new minister, and some of the people break off, and some of them stay. And he and Annie went over to the 19th Street Baptist. It's the Baptist. Yeah, the Methodists do this, too. I don't know if it's a Protestant thing or what, but then I started scouring newspapers, the black newspapers, and sure enough, here and there I would find shreds of he and Annie. Annie was at a church fair. John, turns out, was for 12 years president of the Washington, D.C. Black Sunday School Union. He ran the Sunday schools. Whoa. And then with his children, I was actually able to learn, frankly, more about his children than I was about him, because one of them in particular became quite prominent. It's a long story. I'll spare you. And he lived until almost 1960. So this was a new kind of research, but it's the kind where you're trying to, frankly, what I did with this book, folks, is basically two things, if you couldn't tell already. Number one, I wrote a dual biography of two heretofore utterly unknown ordinary people, former slaves, about whom we knew absolutely nothing, except to start with their own narratives. So it's a dual biography to the extent you can do it. The second thing I did is I turned this book into a history or a story of emancipation. It's emancipation through these two windows, but two remarkable and representative windows. After all, one escapes in Northern Virginia early in the war to the Union Army, before the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's important. That Union officer who freed John Washington in April of 1862 had no legal authority to do it. He did it, by the way, and John says this. He says the officer said to him, well, 48 hours ago in Washington they just passed a law that said all the slaves are free in the District of Columbia, so I guess we can free you. And sure enough, the Congress did, on April 16th, did pass emancipation in D.C. It gave him no authority to do that, but he did it. The other case, Tournage escapes in Mobile, Alabama in August of 64, in a whole different circuit, well after the Emancipation Proclamation, and he escapes to the Union Navy. So it allowed me to tell the story of emancipation through these two windows. That's what really interested me as a historian. Along the way, I got very interested, though, in genealogy and the kind of shreds of evidence that we can find about ordinary people. I mean, we used to assume that the black working class slaves, the black working class former slaves, you just can't know their history. There's nothing to work with. Last Sunday, I even saw where he was buried. You know, there's a certain thrill in that. Anyway, question. Over here? Yes, ma'am. On the left. Or the audience is right.
Thank you. Was it clear from the beginning that these manuscripts were going to be a dual biography, or did you consider other ways of formatting? 2 books, a documentary?
Oh, well, we're still working on that documentary. I'm working with a film producer, a close friend of mine, screenwriter. Who knows what'll happen. There's some interest in Wallace Tournage's story. I'll just leave it at that. At first, I guess I thought I wanted both of them together because I could see right away I got 2 emancipation stories. Why not tell them together? The trick there, though, was getting the 2 owners of the documents to agree to do this. That took a bit of doing. I originally thought I might not learn enough except to just write an introduction. That's about all I could do, I thought at first. But then as we uncovered their post-war lives, I decided to write, which I did, 4 chapters. One is the birth to escape story of John Washington. The second is the birth to escape story of Tournage. The third is their post-war lives folded together as a way of telling the story of what happened to the freedmen who moved into the North. And the 4th chapter, I write a kind of a short history of emancipation itself, of how it came about through Lincoln and the presidency, but also through what scholars have come to call the process of self-emancipation. And I sprinkle and weave these 2 guys into that story So a person can read this book. If you read nothing but the 4th chapter, you'd learn a lot about emancipation. And then I published the narratives, and I did not change a single thing in their writing, except Tournage never met a paragraph. 120 pages of one paragraph. I paragraphed it for the eyes of the reader. They both were very creative with grammar and spelling. They struggled to write. Washington has a more writerly sensibility about him, a broader sense of metaphor. Both really struggled to write. And there are even apologies right in the text. Oh, dear reader, please don't judge me as a writer, blah, blah, blah. But I did annotate both of them extensively, trying to explain, places, dates, people, whenever I could. So, it develop. A book sometimes develops into what it needs to be.
Before we get to the next question, I want to remind those of you who stuck around, there is a book signing with all of Professor Blight's books in the Simons Media Room to your right, and there's lots of cookies, so please take home lots of cookies.
Cookies. Sean has a question. This is daunting.
I want to pitch the book a little bit larger, I think. And not that you've already not done that, but I think that you do a couple other things in the work.
He's a close reader, this guy.
And I think one of the wonderful things, and so I guess there are two ends of the book that I want to kind of address. One of the wonderful things that you do in the beginning of the narrative of their slave life up to their emancipation is that you cast it in the story of all slave narratives. You use the other narratives to tell your story, and the way you're casting these and showing the way that the narratives can be used as historical sources, I think is a wonderful and incredible thing. And then the later life, and we've talked about this a little bit, is you've pieced together some incredible straggling pieces of their lives and taken some leaps at times to try to place them in there. And I think...
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. And I think
I wonder whether they would have been at such and such.
And I think that's a good thing because you're struggling to try to say what happened to these people.
Yeah.
And if you could talk a little bit, I guess, about the challenge of doing that and saying, well, Washington is in Jersey City. And I know this is happening in Jersey City.
Right.
And so maybe he's there. Maybe he's a part of that. And
Or he lived about 12 blocks south of where Frederick Douglass gave an incredible speech in Madison Square on Memorial Day in 1877 with this huge parade of Union veterans. And I thought, how could he not go? He must have heard Douglass give that incredible speech about memory. But I don't know if he was there. If Wallace wasn't there, he missed something. He should have been there. Yeah, I mean, you do that as a writer. I mean, as a historian, we can speculate. We can't make it up and invent, to say the least. In John Washington's case, I have several moments where I wonder what he's thinking in 1874 when the Democratic Party takes back control of the Congress there in Washington, D.C. I wonder what he's thinking when he lives only 3 blocks from the White House when Lincoln is assassinated. I wonder what he's thinking when he buried his second-born child in a Georgetown cemetery the week or 10 days after Lincoln's funeral. I wonder what he was thinking at a certain time, because that's where he's living. He's living in the nation's capital for the next 30-some years, 40 years nearly. So, you can do that as a historian if you're careful about it. If you cover yourself, so to speak. I'll say one other quick thing about that. I have the opportunity now to, maybe I mentioned this earlier, to make a long story short, I'm trying to write a play. The Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission has commissioned me and my film producer friend, who happens to know something about drama. It's good, one of us does. The play is Frederick Douglass Remembering Abraham Lincoln, and we're to have it ready to go and premiere a year from this month for the Lincoln Bicentennial. But in this case, I get to invent. I'm inventing monologue by Frederick Douglass. And God, is it fun. I'm making it up. Some of it. I'm making up some monologue, but it's deeply rooted in what we know about Douglass. But it is an odd feeling as a scholar to suddenly realize, I don't know if he said that, but I'm going to have him say it. And I'm going to have him say that. And, he should have said that. Can't do that in a... anyway, yeah, there are those... I'm trying to tell a story. Look, in case you couldn't tell, this book is essentially about storytelling. They were telling us two stories, and I tried to tell their story without imposing myself in it, without it just becoming my writing. It's their story. But it's their story as representative. This is the first black working class in northern cities. And we can learn something about what happened to them. And that's why I used some of those writings about Black New York, Black Manhattan by James Weldon Johnson, and other works. And by the way, Wallace's children keep dying in infancy. I decided, I got to go learn something about infant mortality. And I read a bunch about, that's your field, Tanya. I started reading everything I could find on infant mortality in American cities in the late 19th century, and then about race and infant mortality. It turns out infant mortality among blacks was horrifyingly higher than it was among whites. When Wallace lost 4 of his 7 children to infant mortality, he was slightly ahead of the average. If a black family had 7 children in an American city in the late 19th century, 3 of them were going to die in infancy, possibly 4. If a white family had 7, probably 2 would die. And they were dying largely of tuberculosis. They're all buried, by the way, too, in Cypress Hills Cemetery. I don't know quite where. Anyway, any other further questions or comments? Yes, one more here. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in construction.
Yes.
I think I know my own personal answer, but why does an ordinary person matter? Why do we need to know about someone who's not a Langston Hughes, who's not a Martin Luther King, who's not an Abraham Lincoln?
Great question. Why does the bottom up matter and not only the top down? Because 95% of the world, maybe 99% of the world, lives from the bottom up and are ordinary. But they live creative, sentient, interesting, opportunistic, ambitious, despairing, tragic lives every day, everywhere. They're the multitude of humanity. They're the multitude of humanity about whom that leadership class is trying to do something, or to whom that leadership class is responding. But I'll tell you, it was a very interesting transition for me. And not that I haven't done some social history before. I did a book about a common soldier in the Civil War and his letters and so on and so forth. But I did a lot of that kind of stuff in Race and Reunion, but most of my work has been about geniuses like Frederick Douglass. And it was a bit of a struggle to try to compare a Wallace Tournage to a Frederick Douglass, but I'm convinced Wallace had read Douglass. I can't prove it, but I'm convinced he had. I'm convinced John Washington had read Douglass. Douglass was a genius with language. And for some reasons I don't think we'll ever completely figure out, neither Wallace or John were geniuses with language. Their education was nil. They had no formal education. Although, by the way, John Washington may have been ordinary, but he was a very skilled, talented, ordinary young man. And he did have some extra schooling of a kind. He tells us that one of his uncles helped him with his writing and reading, and even one white minister helped him. He also describes how much he loved reading Harper's Weekly in his master's house. He said he especially liked the short stories. The ordinary people matter because they build the world, too. They build the world that the leadership class lives in, works in. Multitudes of the world make a lot of things possible. They're much quieter, usually. They don't leave us as much to work with sometimes. but they're the mass of humanity. And frankly, if we want to know what the legacies of slavery are, we can learn a lot about the legacies of slavery from a metaphor like Du Bois's that I started out with tonight in Souls of Black Folk. That's one of the most powerful, terrifying metaphors I've ever read in American letters. And Souls of Black Folk is one of the greatest works by an American. But imagine what else we can learn about the legacies of slavery if we can actually get inside of that northern black working class's lives and understand, well, what is this former slave doing? What can he actually give his children? What are the chances that he actually had? He lived a very difficult life in New York. I mean, I'm convinced of that. And, oh, by the way, I speculate, this is what Sean's referring to, I read all the black newspapers in late 19th century, New York Age and so forth. Lo and behold, the Hamilton Lodge of Oddfellows, his fraternal order, they had masked balls, they had fairs, they had dances, they had all kinds of events, costume balls. I can't place Wallace and his wife at any one of them by name, but I do have to wonder, how could they not have gone? So what's your answer?
I think that when we think,
Yeah. 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 You should still study the geniuses. Yeah. I mean, this is the old story, isn't it? Leadership versus the rest of us. We've learned how to do the rest of us. We learned a lot about how to do the rest of us the last 40 and 50 years. And I finally learned how to work with sources. I used to hate genealogy. You know why? Because when I was in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, every Saturday morning you couldn't get a microfilm reader in the Historical Society or the Memorial Library because the busloads of genealogists would come and they'd be swarming all over the microfilm readers, and I had to get up on a Saturday morning and get there at 8 o'clock in order to find a place in the library. I hated genealogists. And then I had to become one. Oh, you can learn a lot from that stuff. From one obituary or one bank record, and then the next bank record, and you begin to put a person's life together. And by the way, in Fredericksburg, at least 4 buildings that John lived in are still there. There's a bank. It's called the Farmers Bank. They still call it that. Beautiful old brick structure. It's still a bank. But since this story has been exposed and discovered, they now have an exhibition about John Washington. And when you go there, they will take you up to the corner room in which he slept. And in that room is where his mother said goodbye to him when he was 10 years old, and they'll tell you that. That was one of my proudest moments when we had this event there, and I realized, the bank has adopted him. Okay.
Okay,
Thank
very
you.
Thank you.